All right, joining us now for more on the latest coronavirus developments, as well as what he saw this weekend with some states starting to reopen. Former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb, he's a CNBC contributor, also serves on the boards of Illumina and Pfizer. In his latest Wall Street Journal op-ed, Dr. Gottlieb calls for scaling up rapid coronavirus antigen tests, similar to ones that exist for the flu or strep throat. Let me first ask you, Doctor, something that you said on one of the shows over the weekend was that the stay-in-place orders that we've put in here didn't work, or at least didn't work as well as had hoped. What did you mean by that? Tell us what you mean by that, and how did we do it wrong?
Well, look, they did work. Mitigation was intended to prevent a huge spike in the number of cases that would overwhelm the healthcare system. We've clearly done that. We flattened the curve. The healthcare system didn't become overwhelmed as we all feared. If you saw some of the early projections about what it looked like, what it was going to look like in New York, cities like Detroit, Chicago, New Orleans, that didn't come to pass. I think a lot of us thought, though, that those measures would decrease the number of daily cases more rapidly and to a lower level. And what we've seen is sort of a persistent plateau now for around 30 days. And so as we start to reopen aspects of the economy, it's unlikely those cases are going to start to come down even more. More likely they'll creep up a little bit. The only thing that could change, perhaps, is this summer, is the warm weather, that it does provide a backstop, and so maybe it cancels each other out. Maybe the warm weather's a backstop, and as we reopen, we get a little bit of a bump in cases, and we just sort of plateau around these levels. That's unclear right now, but I think a lot of us thought mitigation would have an effect on reducing the number of cases more sharply than has happened right now. Now, finally, I'll say, we always knew that when we put in place these mitigation steps, what you do is you flatten the curve, but you extend the length of the epidemic, and that's in fact what happened. So it may be that it's still going to come down, and we just haven't seen it yet.
Plus, the United States is so big, and Europe, you saw it move across Europe. Well, here it's like our states are analogous to some of the countries as it moves across, for where it wasn't before, right. It goes there, and we're sort of seeing that too, aren't we? Can you explain what happened in Florida? Doctor, did you see the Wall Street Journal piece? I mean, I do remember people were ready to just grill the governor down there for not doing what he was supposed to do. And as it turns out, the worst case scenario did not happen. Why?
Unclear. I mean, in Florida, the epidemic really stayed around Miami. The cases do appear to be coming down in Florida. Hospitalizations are starting to plateau there, too. They're not testing as much, so I don't think I would sound an all clear on Florida or Georgia, for that matter, where they saw a bump up in cases. There could be a weather effect down in Florida. We don't really understand why certain parts of the country seem more affected than the others, but Florida did not. The sort of scary scenarios that we were worried about initially haven't come to pass in Florida, haven't come to pass in a lot of other cities. I think the mitigation did work around the country. I think the challenge now, though, is that we're having about 30,000 cases a day, about 2,000 deaths a day. Hopefully that comes down from here, but we may have to grapple with just a persistent level of spread, and we need to understand what that looks like. What happens if we, sort of plateau at 20,000 cases a day that we diagnose? That means it's probably really 200,000 cases a day because we're diagnosing 1 in 10, and we sustain, 1,000 deaths a day. What does that look like? How do we open against that backdrop? What do we need to do differently? And one of the things we need to do is protect the vulnerable communities. There's a lot of communities and jobs that are more vulnerable to spread than others, and we need to focus resources into those areas.
What's the type of test? We call it an antigen test. What kind of test are you advocating? Is it the typical positive antibody test, or which one do you want?
No, it's like a swabbable stick. It's what we have for flu, like the company Quidel makes. The sensitivity goes down when you use those tests. They're not as sensitive as PCR-based tests, but they allow you to move testing into the community more easily, maybe even into pharmacies, where you just swab someone with a stick that has antibodies on it that reacts when it comes into contact with the antigen from the virus. So you get a readable result right in a doctor's office. That's going to allow testing to be more ubiquitous. A box of those tests for strep throat of like 25 tests, I think it's about $100, maybe a little bit more. But it's cheap, it's easy. You can move it into the community.
Okay, I see what you're saying. When, in terms of vaccines, we heard the president, and just like everything, he's going to get, if he says we could have it by the end of the year as far as a vaccine, people are going to immediately say it's a false hope. But you have said it's possible that there's something in the fall, at least we may identify something that seems to work. Maybe we can't scale it up to, hundreds of millions of doses. But it's possible in the fall that either J&J or Pfizer or Oxford or Moderna could have something that works. Maybe we have more than one that work.
Yeah, look, I think we need multiple companies to be successful. And the more that we reopen against a backdrop of spread, when we know there's going to be persistent spread, the more we're dependent upon technology really to create an inflection point here. I think by the fall, we could have millions of doses, maybe the low tens of millions of doses, and be able to deploy a vaccine experimentally still in a protocol, so in a clinical trial. But if we have an outbreak in a large city, deploy the vaccine in that city to sort of ring fence the infection and use it both therapeutically, potentially, but also learn whether it's fully safe and effective for mass inoculation of the population. That's how these vaccines are likely to be used in the setting of outbreaks in the fall, and I think we'll have millions of doses to be able to use it that way.
We will maybe see remdesivir used now that they're trying to give it out freely. We don't know mortality-wise whether there's improvement, but we kind of might extrapolate to that if you get out of the hospital quicker. Do you expect to see that help? And are people still prescribing hydroxychloroquine in certain settings? Do you know at this point? They're still doing that, aren't they?
Well, with remdesivir, there's a trend towards improved mortality in the clinical trial. It didn't reach statistical significance, but the trial isn't done, so they'll continue to follow those patients. I suspect that the drug shortening hospitalizations and it's having a direct effect on the virus, reducing viral load. It's going to have an impact on mortality when these trials run to completion. But it's certainly providing benefit. Again, as we've said all along, it's not a home run. It's a first-generation drug. With respect to hydroxychloroquine, doctors have pulled away from it. I'm sure it's still being prescribed. But if you talk to the doctors in New York City, and those are primarily the doctors that I talk to, they've pulled away from using it because they just haven't seen the kind of results that they were hoping to see with that drug. There are still clinical trials underway, so we'll have an answer on whether or not it's providing a benefit. But if it is, it's probably pretty modest, or we would have seen a more robust treatment effect.
You remember Ebola and the way that initially it was remdesivir, and then that was supplanted, or at least there was an additive antibody treatment, I think. When do you expect that? Is that possible by fall to have another therapeutic to use in conjunction with remdesivir that would really have an even more powerful effect? Is that possible by fall?
Absolutely. And there's 4 companies working on it: Amgen, Vir Biotechnology, Lilly, and Regeneron. They all have antibodies that they've identified they're going to be in the clinic. The challenge there is just going to be manufacturing at a scale, and we could be investing in that right now. That's where the government really needs to focus attention, is on trying to free up manufacturing space domestically to make these products at scale. But we could have one or more of these available in the fall, and if you combine a therapeutic antibody that can be used prophylactically and therapeutically as a treatment with remdesivir, that's a pretty good toolbox. You combine that with massive screening, which we're going to have in the fall, and you're starting to have a technological toolbox that can mitigate risk and return more aspects of the economy and of American life back to some semblance of normalcy. We're going to be really dependent upon technology, because I think what we've learned from mitigation is, while it's flattened the curve, it hasn't snuffed out the virus. And so we're going to have persistent spread, and it's probably going to flare up in the fall. But these tools should really help us.
Dr. Gottlieb, you mentioned those antibody tests that, they can very quickly in the doctor's office tell you if you've had the antibody, that they're pretty cheap. You can get a bunch of them for $100. Are they readily available? And if not, when would they be?
Well, there's a difference between an antibody test and an antigen test. So the antibody tests that we talk about now that are on the market test for antibodies to see if you've been exposed. The test I'm talking about is an antigen test. It's basically, instead of testing for an antibody, it has an antibody on the stick. And what it's testing for is the antigen, the particles that the virus produces that betrays its presence in the blood. So the two bind together, and they can be used for a rapid diagnostic. So when you go to the doctor's office and you get a rapid flu test, someone swabs you quickly, or a strep throat test, it's often an antigen test. Those are under development. I don't know where they are. I think we should be putting a lot of effort into getting them on the market. They're not perfect. They give false negative results. They're not as sensitive as a PCR-based test, but they're so cheap and easy to use that you can deploy testing more widely once you have these available. So we should be making an effort to get these onto the market pretty soon. And I know we're going to have them. It's just a question of when.
Right. Doctor, I've got 2 questions. One's a medical one, and I know a lot of business executives over the past week have been reaching out to try to get the antibody test, specifically from LabCorp and a couple of other places. Are you recommending that? Do you think that makes sense? If you get the antibody test and you find out you have the antibody, how should you change your behavior?
I don't think those antibody tests are useful for individual decision-making around patients. They're useful for getting a sense of how much of the overall population in different parts of the country have been exposed to the virus or different settings, different workplaces. If you do go out and get an antibody test and you get a positive result, meaning you have the antibodies, I would suggest you repeat it because there's such a high false positive rate, meaning the tests say you have antibodies when you don't, that I wouldn't put any stock in any single result. If you repeat the test and you get a second positive test, the positive predictive value of that test goes up. And so you can have a little bit more confidence. Quite frankly, if it was me, I'd repeat it 3 times. I know they're expensive, but I wouldn't put confidence in any one test.
And then if you had it and you felt like you were positive and you did it 2 or 3 times, would you take off your mask? I mean, I'm just trying to understand what the true implication is here.
I'd have a little more confidence. I mean, I'm speaking personally right now. If I truly had the infection, I've cleared the infection, either have evidence of it on antibody tests or I've been diagnosed with coronavirus and you know you've had it and you've gotten better, I think you could be reasonably confident that you have a level of immunity. Now, how long that lasts, we're unsure. It's probably going to be months. It might be a year or more. But I think for the next 6 months, you can be reasonably confident that you're not going to get reinfected. And if you do, you're going to have a mild case. And so I wouldn't go out and do crazy things, but I'd feel more confident going around if it was me.
And then finally, Doctor, could you just weigh in on this issue that Meg Terrell brought us, this news earlier today, that because the federal government is effectively taking over the Gilead remdesivir drug, that it's unlikely to be available, at least in the immediate term, to other countries, and the implications of that from a geopolitical perspective, our ability to access other drugs in the future, vaccines and the like, and things that need to be manufactured outside of our own country?
Well, the idea that the American government is going to try to control the supply and stockpile this doesn't surprise me. I think that we should have assumed they were going to do that. I think that there's probably going to be an effort made by the government to allocate drug to other countries. And in fact, I think they're going to need to do that because part of the Gilead supply chain, as I understand it, courses through other countries. So you can't cut them off from the drug if you're dependent upon them for aspects of the ingredients that go into the drug or certain aspects of manufacturing the drug. So there's going to need to be some difficult decisions made about allocating a certain amount of that supply to other countries. Europe's probably going to approve it soon, and so Europe's going to want a commercial supply as well. So the American government's going to have to grapple with this and allocate some of that drug internationally. Now, hopefully, Gilead ramps manufacturing fast enough, and I know they're working on it, that these allocation decisions, don't have to be made. So I think that that's going to happen. We're going to have hopefully millions of doses by the fall. The fact that the FDA authorized 5 days of treatment rather than 10 is also very meaningful because it effectively doubles the supply that Gilead has available.
All right, Dr. Gottlieb, thank you. Where do you get? You can't just get an antibody test, right? You say it's expensive. What would you do? If you wanted one, how do you do it?
Well, you can just get them now. I mean, Quest is offering them. A lot of the commercial labs are. There's tests that have been authorized. So you can go to a doctor's office and get one. Some doctors are even advertising.
I think
they're around $100.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You have to go. I wouldn't go online.
Wouldn't go online. Okay. All right, doctor. Thank you.